Welcome, Wapham crew, guys, gals, ghouls, friends, fiends, foes, whoever may be listening tonight beyond the Omniverse. Secure your tinfoil hats, buckle down tight, and hold on loosely as we soar over the rocky tops of the La Platas on a rocky mountain high, get sucked into the vortex of the Four Corners, and settle down snugly at mile marker 420 in colorful Colorado. It is Sunday, December 29th. Monday, December 30th, for those of you across the pond and beyond. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you, and welcome to We Are Paradox Media's Late Night in the Rockies. I'm your host, TessaTNT, and we are broadcasting live from the Mile High Clubhouse tonight. If you're listening live right now, you may be listening to us on YouTube, Facebook, or Twitch. Please make sure you subscribe, give that little bell a tickle, that way next time we have a show come on, you would be made aware of it. And if you want to listen in your free time, you can just listen anywhere you listen to your podcast. So I don't know if the music came through for the intro. It didn't look like it, so I'm trying to figure out what the crack is going on. I mean, everything looks normal. I'll go to my main sound settings just to check it out real quick. So tonight we have story time with me, TessaTNT, and we are going to be getting into Stephen King's Insomnia. And yeah, it's been a pretty good book so far. Okay, well, everything looks good on the sound there. Just let me know in the chat if you can hear the music or not when we are on break. And that way I can try to figure out what the heck is going on. That's awfully cynical and awfully true. That's the sad part. You know what? He's 35 or 36, and he's somehow gotten the idea that when he hits 40, he's just going to stop, stay 40 for as long as he wants to. He's got an idea that people are old once they get to be 60, and that even the best of them are pretty much in their dotage by the age of 68 or so. And that once you're past 80, it'd be a mercy if your relatives would turn you over to that Dr. Kevorkian. Children don't have any rights of confidentiality from their parents, and as far as Litchfield is concerned, old poops like us don't have any rights of confidentiality from our kids. It wouldn't be in our best interests, you see. Carl Litchfield did practically the minute I was out of his examining room was to phone Harold in Bangor. He said I wasn't sleeping, that I was suffering from depression, and that I was having the sort of sensory problems that accompany a premature decline in cognition. And then he said, "You have to remember that your mother is getting on in years, Mr. Chase, and if I were you, I'd think very seriously about her situation down here in Derry." "He didn't," Ralph cried, amazed and horrified. "I mean, did he?" Lois was nodding grimly. "He said it to Harold, and Harold said it to me, and now I'm saying it to you. Silly old me. I don't even know what a premature decline in cognition meant. Neither of them wanted to tell me. I looked up cognition in the dictionary. Do you know what it means?" "Thinking," Ralph said. "Cognition is thinking. Right, my doctor called my son to tell him I was going senile." Lois laughed angrily and used Ralph's handkerchief to wipe fresh tears off her cheek. "I can't believe it," Ralph said. But the hell of it was he could. Ever since Carolyn's death, he had been aware that the naivety with which he had regarded the world up until the age of 18 or so had apparently not departed forever, when he crossed the threshold between childhood and manhood. A peculiar innocence seemed to be returning, as he stepped over the threshold between manhood and old manhood. Things kept surprising him, except surprise was really too mild a word. What a lot of them did was knock him glass over tea kettle. The little bottles under the kissing bridge, for instance. He had taken a long walk out of Basie Park one day in July and had gone under the bridge to rest out the afternoon sun for a while. He had barely gotten comfortable before noticing a little pile of broken glass in the weeds by the stream that trickled beneath the bridge. He had swept up the high grass with a length of broken branch and discovered 6 or 8 small bottles. One had some crusty white stuff in it at the bottom. Ralph had picked it up, and as he turned it curiously before his eyes, he realized he was looking at the remains of a crack party. He had dropped the bottle as if it were hot. He could still remember the number. The numb shock he had felt, his unsuccessful attempt to convince himself that he was nuts and that it couldn't be what he thought it was. Not in this hick town, 250 miles north of Boston. Was the emerging knave, which had been shocked. Of course, that part of him seemed to believe, or not until he had discovered the little bottles under the kissing bridge, that all those news stories about the cocaine epidemic had just been make-believe, no more real than a TV crime show or Jean-Claude Van Damme movie. He felt the familiar sensation of shock now. Harold said they wanted to run me up to Bangor and show me the place, Lois was saying. He never takes me for rides these days, and he just runs me places. Like I'm an errand. They had lots of brochures, and when Harold gave Janet the nod, she wiped them out so fast. Whoa, slow down, what place? What brochures? I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. Aren't I? It's a place in Bangor called Riverview Estates. Ralph knew the name. I'd gotten a brochure himself, as a matter of fact. One of those mass-mailing things, this one targeted at people 65 and over. Jim McGovern had shared a laugh about it, but the laugh had been just a touch uneasy, like kids whistling past the graveyard. Shit, Lois, that's the retirement home, isn't it? No, sir, she said, widening her eyes innocently. That's what I said, but Harold and Janet set me straight. No, Ralph, Riverview Estates is a condominium development site for community-oriented senior citizens. When Harold said that, I said, is that so? Well, let me tell you both something. You can put a fruit pie from McDonald's in a sterling silver chafing dish and call it a French tart, but it's still just a fruit pie from McDonald's as far as I'm concerned. When I said that, Harold started to sputter and get red in the face, but Jan just gave me that sweet little smile of hers, the one she saves up for special occasions because she knows it drives me crazy. She says, well, why don't we look at the brochures anyway, Mother Lois? You'll do that much, won't you, after we both took personal days from work and drove all the way down here to see you? Like Derry was in the heart of Africa, Ralph muttered. Lois took his hand and said something that made him laugh. Oh, to her it is. Was this before or after you found out Litchfield had tattled? Ralph asked. He used the same word Lois had on purpose. It seemed to fit this situation better than a fancier word or phrase would have done. Committed a breach of confidentiality is far too dignified for this nasty bit of work. Litchfield had run and tattled, simple as that. Before I thought I might as well look at the brochures. After all, they'd come 40 miles and it wouldn't exactly kill me, so I looked while they ate the food I'd fixed. Wasn't any that had to be scraped into the swill later on either, and drank coffee. It's quite a place, that Riverview. They have their own medical staff on duty 24 hours a day, in their own kitchen. When you move in, they give you a complete physical and decide what you can have to eat. There's the red diet plan, the blue diet plan, the green diet plan, and the yellow diet plan. There were 3 or 4 other colors as well. I can't remember what all of them were, but yellow is for diabetics and blue is for fatties. Ralph thought of eating 3 scientifically balanced meals a day for the rest of his life. No more sausage pizzas from Gambino's. No more coffee pot sandwiches. No more chili burgers from Mexico Mills. And found the prospect almost unbearably grim. Also, Lois said brightly, they have a pneumatic tube system that delivers your daily pills right to your kitchen. Isn't that a marvelous idea, Ralph? I guess so, Ralph said. Oh, yes, it is. It's marvelous. The wave of the future. There's a computer to oversee everything, and I bet it never has a decline in cognition. There's a special bus that takes the Riverview people to the places of scenic or cultural interest twice a week, and it also takes them shopping. You have to take the bus because Riverview people aren't allowed to have cars. Good idea, he said, giving her hand a little squeeze. There are a few drunks on Saturday night compared to an old fogey with a slippery cognition on the loose in a Buick sedan. She didn't smile, as he had hoped she would. The pictures in those brochures burned my blood. Old ladies playing canasta, old men throwing horseshoes, both flavors together in this big, pine-paneled room they call the River Hall. Square dancing. Although that is sort of a nice name, don't you think? River Hall? I guess it's okay. I mean, I think it sounds like the kind of room you'd find in an enchanted castle, but I visited quite a few old friends in Strawberry Fields. That's the geriatrics home in Skowhegan. And I know an old folks rec room when I see one. It doesn't matter how pretty a name you give it. There's still a cabinet full of board games in the corner of the jigsaw puzzles with the 5 or 6 pieces missing from each one. And the TV's always turned to something like Family Feud and never to the kind of movies where good-looking young people take off their clothes and roll around on the floor together in front of the fireplace. Those rooms always smell of paste and piss and the 5 and dime watercolors that come in a long tin box. In despair, Rose looked at him with hard, dark eyes. I'm only 68, Ralph. I know that 68 doesn't seem like only anything to Dr. Fountain of Youth, but it does to me, because my mother was 92 when she died last year, and my dad lived to be 86. In my family, dying at 80 is dying young. And if I had to spend 12 years living in a place where they announced dinner over the loudspeaker, I'd go crazy. I would too. I looked, though. I wanted to be polite, and when I was finished, I made a neat little pile of them and handed them back to Jan. I said they were very interesting and thanked her. She nodded and smiled and put them back in her purse. I thought that was going to be the end of it, and good riddance, but then Harold said, "Hold on, Ma." For a second, I was so scared I couldn't breathe. I thought they'd already signed me up. And I had an idea that if I said I wasn't going, Harold would open the door and there would be 2 or 3 men in white coats outside. And one of them would smile and say, "Good morning, Mrs. Chase. Once you get that first handful of pills delivered direct to your kitchen, you'll never want to live anywhere else." I don't want to put my coat on, I told Harold. And I tried to sound the way I used to, when he was only 10 and always tracking mud into the kitchen, but my heart was beating so hard that I could hear it tapping in my voice. I've changed my mind about going out. I forgot how much I had to do today. And then Jan gave the laugh I hate even more than her syrupy little smile and said, "Why, Mother Lois, what would you have to do that's so important you can't go up to Bangor with us, after we've taken time off to come down to Derry and see you?" That woman always gets my back hair up, and I guess I do the same to her. I must, because I've never in my life known one woman to smile that much at another without hating her guts. Anyway, I told her I had to wash the kitchen floor and start with, "Just look at it," I said, "dirty as the devil." Harold says, "Can't believe you're going to send us back to the city empty-handed after we came all the way down here, Ma." Well, I'm not moving into that place no matter how far you came, I said back. So you can get that idea right out of your head. I've been living in Derry for 35 years, half my life. All my friends are here, and I'm not moving. They looked at each other the way parents do when they've got a kid who stopped being cute and started being a pain in the tail. Janet patted my shoulder and said, "Now don't get all upset, Mother Lois. We only want you to come and look. Like, it has the brochures again, and all I had to do was be polite." Just the same, her saying it was just to set my mind at ease a little. I should have known that they couldn't make me live there or even afford it on their own. It's Mr. Chase's money they're counting on to swing it. His pension and the railroad insurance I got because he died on the job. It turned out they had an appointment all made for 11 o'clock, and a man lined up to show me around and give me the whole pitch. I was mostly over being scared by the time I got all that straight in my head, but I was hurt by the high-handed way they were treating me, and mad at how every other thing out of Janet's mouth was personal days this and personal days that. It's pretty clear that she could think of a lot better ways to spend a day than coming to Derry to see her fat old bag of a mother-in-law. "Stop fluttering and come on, Mother," she says after a little more back and forth. Like I was so pleased with the whole idea, I couldn't even decide which hat to wear. "Hop into your coat. I'll help you clean up the breakfast things and when we get back." "You didn't hear me," I said. "I'm not going anywhere. Why waste a beautiful fall day like this touring a place I'll never live in? And what gives you the right to drive down here and give me this kind of bum's rush in the first place? Why didn't one of you at least call and say, 'We have an idea, Mom. Want to hear it?' Isn't that how you would have treated one of your friends?" And when I said that, they traded another glance. Lois sighed, wiped her eyes a final time, and gave back Ralph's handkerchief. Damper, but otherwise none the worse for wear. Well, I knew from that look that we hadn't reached bottom yet. Mostly it was the way Harold looked, like he did when he just hooked a handful of chocolate bits out of the bag in the pantry. And Janet, she gave him back the expression I disliked most of all, her bulldozer look, I call it. And then she asked him if he wanted to tell me what the doctor had said, or if she should do it. In the end, they both told it, and by the time they were done, I was so mad and scared that I felt like yanking my hair out by the roots. The thing I just couldn't seem to get over, no matter how hard I tried, was the thought of Carl Litchfield telling Harold all the things I thought were private, calling him up and telling him like there was nothing in the world wrong with it. "So you think I'm senile?" I asked Harold. "Is that what it comes down to? You and Jan think I've gone soft in the attic." The last age of 68. Harold got red in the face and started shuffling his feet under his chair and muttering under his breath. Something about how he didn't think any such thing, but he had considered my safety, just like I always considered his when he was growing up. And all the time Janet was sitting at the counter nibbling a muffin and giving him a look I could have killed her for, as if she thought he was just a cockroach that had learned to talk like a lawyer. Then she got up and asked if she could use the facility. I told her to go ahead and managed to keep from saying it would be a relief to have her out of the room for 2 minutes. "Thanks, Mother Lois," she says. "I won't be long. Harry and I have to leave soon, so if you feel you can't come with us and keep your appointment, then I guess there's nothing more to say." "What a peach," Ralph said. "Well, that was the end of it for me. I'd had enough. I keep my appointments, Janet Chase," I said, "but only the ones I make for myself. I give a fart in high wind for the ones other people make for me." Well, she tossed up her hands like I was the most unreasonable woman who ever walked the face of the earth, and left me with Harold. He was looking at me with those big brown eyes of his like he expected me to apologize. I almost felt like I should apologize too, if only to get the Cocker Spaniel look off his face, but I didn't. I wouldn't. I just looked back at him, and after a while he couldn't stand it anymore and told me I ought to stop being mad. He said he was just worried about me down here all by myself, and that he was only trying to be a good son, and Janet was only trying to be a good daughter. I guess I understand that, I said, but you should know that sneaking around behind a person's back is no way to express love and concern. He got all stiff and said he and Jan didn't see it as sneaking around. He cut his eyes towards the bathroom for a second or two, and when he said it, I pretty much got the idea that what he meant was Jan didn't see it as sneaking around. Then he told me it wasn't the way I was making it out to be. That Litchfield had called him, not the other way around. All right, I said back, but what kept you from hanging up once you realized what he'd called to talk to you about? That was just plain wrong, Harry. What in God's good name got into you? He started to flutter and flap around. I think he might even have started to apologize. When Jan came back and the you-know-what really hit the fan. He asked where the diamond earrings were and the ones they'd given me for Christmas. It was such a change of direction that at first I could only sputter, and I suppose I sounded like I was going senile. Finally, I managed to say that they were in the little china dish on my bedroom bureau, same as always. I have a jewelry box, but I keep those earrings and 2 or 3 other nice pieces out because they're so pretty that looking at them always cheers me up. Besides, they're only clusters of diamond chips. It's not like anyone would want to break in just to steal those. Same with the engagement ring and my ivory cameo, which are the other 2 pieces I keep in that dish. Lois gave Ralph an intense, pleading look. He squeezed her hand again. She smiled and took a deep breath. This is very hard for me. If you want to stop, no, I want to finish, except that past a certain point, I can't remember what happened anyway. It was all so horrible. You see, Janet said she knew where I kept them, but they weren't there. My engagement ring was, and the cameo was, but not my Christmas earrings. I went in to check myself, and she was right. We turned the place upside down looking everywhere, but we didn't find them. They're gone. Lois was now gripping Ralph's hand in both of her own and seemed to be talking mostly to the zipper of his jacket. We took all the clothes out of the bureau. Harold pulled the bureau itself out from the wall and looked behind it, under the bed and sofa cushions. And it seemed like every time I looked at Janet, she was looking back at me, giving me that sweet, wide-eyed look of hers. Sweet as melting butter it is, except in the eyes anyway, and she didn't have to come right out and say what she was thinking because I already knew. You see how right Dr. Litchfield was to call us and how right we were to make that appointment? And how pig-headed you were being because you need to be in a place like Riverview Estates. And this just proves it. You've lost the lovely earrings we gave you for Christmas. You're having a serious decline in cognition, and this just proves it. It won't be long before you're leaving the stove burners on or the bathroom heater. She began to cry again, and these tears made Ralph's heart hurt. They were the deep, scouring sobs of someone who has been shamed to the deepest level of her being. Lois hid her face against his jacket. He tightened his arm around her. Lois, he thought. Our Lois. But no, he didn't like the sound of that anymore if he ever had. My Lois, he thought, and at that instant, as if some greater power had approved, the day began to fill with light again. Sounds took on a new resonance. He looked down at his hands and Lois's, entwined on her lap, and saw a lovely blue-gray nimbus around them, the color of cigarette smoke. The auras had returned. Section 3. "He should have sent them away the minute he realized the earrings were gone," he heard himself say, and each word was separate and gorgeously unique, like a crystal thunderclap. "The very second." "Oh, I know that now," Lois said. "She was just waiting for me to stick my foot in my mouth, and of course I obliged, but I was so upset. First, the argument about whether or not I was going to Bangor with them to look at Riverview Estates, then hearing my doctor told them things he had no right to tell them, and on top of all that, finding out I'd lost one of my most treasured possessions. And do you know what the cherry on top was? Having her be the one to discover those earrings were gone. Do you blame me for not knowing what to do?" "No," he said, and lifted her gloved hands to his mouth. The sound of them passing through the air was like the hoarse whisper of a palm sliding down a wool blanket. And for a moment he clearly saw the shape of his lips on the back of her right glove, printed there in a blue kiss. Lois smiled. "Thank you, Ralph." "Welcome." "I suppose you have a pretty good idea of how things turned out, don't you?" Jan said. "You really should take better care, Mother Lois. Only Dr. Litchfield says you've come to a time of life when you really can't take better care, and that's why we've been thinking about Riverview Estates. I'm sorry we ruffled your feathers, but it seemed important to move quickly. Now you see why." Ralph looked up. Overhead, the sky was a cataract of green-blue fire filled with clouds that looked like chrome airboats. He looked down the hill and saw Rosalie still lying between the portcullis. Dark gray balloon string rose from her snout, wavering in the cool October breeze. "I got really mad then," she broke off and smiled. Ralph thought it was the first smile he'd seen from her today, which expressed real humor instead of some less pleasant and more complicated emotion. "No, that's not right. I did more than just get mad. If my great-nephew had been there, I would have said, 'Nana went nuclear.'" Ralph laughed and Lois laughed with them, but her laugh sounded a trifle forced. "What galls me is that Janet knew I would," she said. "She wanted me to go nuclear, I think, because she knew how guilty I'd feel later on. And God knows I do. I screamed at them to get the hell out. Harold looked like he wanted to sink right through the floorboards. Shouting has always made him so embarrassed, but Jan just sat there with her hands folded in her lap, smiling and actually nodding her head as if to say, "That's right, Mother Lois. You go on and get all that nasty old poison out of your system, and when it's gone, maybe you'll be ready to hear sense." Lois took a deep breath. And something happened. I'm not sure just what. This wasn't the first time either, but it was the worst time. I'm afraid it was some kind of seizure. Anyway, I started to see Janet in a really funny way, a really scary way. And I said something that finally got to her. I can't remember what it was, and I'm not sure what I want to know, but it certainly wiped that sweetie sweet smile I'd hate so much off her face. In fact, she just about dragged Harold out. The last thing I remember her saying is that one of them would call me when I wasn't so hysterical that I couldn't help making ugly accusations about the people who loved me. We stayed in my house for a little while after they were gone, and then I came out to sit in the park. Sometimes just sitting in the sun makes the body feel better. I stopped in the Red Apple for a snack, and that's when I heard you and Bill had a fight. Are you and he really on the outs, do you think? Ralph shook his head. Nah, we'll make it up. I really like Bill, but you have to be careful what you say with him, she finished. Also, Ralph, may I add that you can't take what he says too seriously? This time it was Ralph who gave their linked hands a squeeze. That might be good advice for you too, Lois. You shouldn't take what happened this morning too seriously. She sighed. Maybe, but it's hard not to. I said some terrible things at the end, Ralph. Terrible. That awful smile of hers. A rainbow of understanding suddenly lit Ralph's consciousness. In its glow, he saw a very large thing, so large it seemed both unquestionable and preordained. He fully faced Lois for the first time since the auras had returned to him, or since he had returned to them. She sat in a capsule of translucent gray light, as bright as fog, on a summer morning which was about to turn sunny. It transformed the woman Bill McGovern called our Lois into a creature of great dignity and almost unbearable beauty. She looks like Eos, he thought, goddess of the dawn. Lois stirred uneasily on the bench. Ralph, why are you looking at me that way? Because you're beautiful and because I've fallen in love with you, Ralph thought, amazed. Right now I'm so in love with you that I feel as if I'm drowning, and the dying's fine. Because you remember exactly what you said. She began to play nervously with the clasp of her purse again. No, yes, you do. You told your daughter-in-law that she took your earrings. She did it because she realized you were going to stick your guns about and not going with them, and not getting what she wants makes her daughter-in-law crazy. It makes her go nuclear. She did it because you pissed her off. Isn't that about the size of it? Lois looked at him with round, frightened eyes. How do you know that, Ralph? How do you know that about her? You know it because you know it, and you know it because you saw it. Oh, no, she whispered. No, I didn't see anything. I was in the kitchen with Harold the whole time. Not then, not when she did it, but when she came back. You saw it in her and all around her. As he himself now saw Harold chase his wife and Lois, as if the woman sitting beside him on the bench had become a lens. Janet Chase was tall, fair-skinned, and long-waisted. Her cheeks were spattered with freckles she covered with makeup, and her hair was a vivid, gingery shade of red. This morning she had come to Derry with that fabulous hair lying over one shoulder in a bulky braid like a sheath of copper wire. What else did he know about this woman he had never met? Everything. Everything. She covers her freckles with pancake because she thinks they make her look childish, that people don't take women with freckles seriously. Her legs are beautiful and she knows it. She wears short skirts to work, but today, when she came to see old bitch Mother Lois, she was wearing a cardigan and an old pair of jeans, dairy dress downs. Her period is overdue. She's reached that time of life when it doesn't come as regular as clockwork anymore. And during that uneasy 2 or 3 day pause she suffers through every month. Pause when the whole world seems made of glass and everyone in it seems either stupid or wicked. Her behavior and her moods have become erratic. That's probably the real reason she did what she did. Ralph saw her coming out of Lois's tiny bathroom, saw her shoot an intense, furious glance toward the kitchen door. There's no sign of the sweetie, sweet, sweet smile on that narrow, intense face now, and then scoop the earrings out of the china dish. Saw her cram them into the left front pocket of her jeans. No, Lois had not actually witnessed this small, ugly theft, but it had changed the color of Jan Chase's aura from the pale green to a complex, layered pattern of browns and reds, which Lois had seen and understood at once, probably without the slightest idea of what was really happening to her. She took them all right, Ralph said. He could see a gray mist drifting dreamily across the pupils of Lois's wide eyes. He could have looked at it for the rest of the day. Yes, but if you'd agreed to keep the appointment at Riverview Estates after all, I bet you would have found them again after her next visit. Or she would have found them. I guess that's more likely. Just a lucky accident. Oh, Mother Lois, come see what I found. Under the bathroom sink or in a closet or lying in some dark corner. Yes? She looked into his face now, fascinated, almost hypnotized. She must feel terrible, and she won't dare bring them back, will she? Not after the things I said. Ralph, how did you know? The same way you did. How long have you been seeing the auras, Lois? Section 4. Get some water. I'm parched. Auras? I don't know what you mean. Except she did. Litchfield told your son about the insomnia, but I doubt if that alone would have been enough to get even Litchfield to, tattle. The other thing, what you said he called sensory problems, went right by me. I was too amazed by the idea of anyone thinking you could possibly be prematurely senile. I guess, even though I've been having my own sensory problems lately. You? Yes, ma'am. Then just a little bit ago, you said something more interesting. You said you started to see Janet in a really funny way. A really scary way. You couldn't remember what you said just before the two of them walked out, but you knew exactly how you felt. You're seeing the other part of the world, the rest of the world. Shapes around things, shapes inside things, sounds within sounds. Call it the world of auras, and that's what you're experiencing, isn't it, Lois? She looked at him silently for a moment, then put her hands over her face. I thought I was losing my mind, she said, and then said it again. Oh, Ralph, I thought I was losing my mind. Section 5. He hugged her and then let her go and tilted her chin up. No more tears, he said. I didn't bring a spare hanky. No more tears, she agreed, but her eyes were already brimming again. Ralph, if you only knew how awful it's been. I do know. She smiled radiantly. Yes, you do, don't you? You made that idiot Litchfield decide you were slipping into senility. Except Alzheimer's is probably what he had in mind. It wasn't just insomnia, but insomnia accompanied by something else. Something he decided were hallucinations, right? I guess, but he didn't say anything like that at the time. When I told him about the things I'd been seeing, the colors and all, he seemed very understanding. And the minute you were out the door, he called your son and told him to get the hell down to Derry and do something about old Mom. You're starting to see people walking around in colored envelopes with long balloon strings floating up from their heads. You see those too? Ralph, you see those too? Me too, he said and laughed. It sounded a bit loon-like, and he wasn't surprised. There were 100 things he wanted to ask her. He felt crazed with impatience. And there was something else, something so unexpected, he hadn't even been able to identify it at first. He was horny, not just interested, actually horny. Lois was crying again. Her tears were the color of mist on a still lake, and we smoked a little as they slipped down her cheeks. Ralph knew they would taste dark and mossy, like fiddleheads in spring. Ralph, this is, oh my, bigger than Michael Jackson at the Super Bowl, isn't it? She laughed weakly. Well, just a little. There's a name of what's happened to us, Lois, and it's not insomnia or senility or Alzheimer's disease. It's hyperreality. Hyperreality? She murmured. God, what an exotic word. Yes, it is. The pharmacist down the street at Rite Aid, Joe Weiser, told it to me. Only there's a lot more to it than he knew. More than anyone in their right mind would guess. Yes, like telepathy. If it's really happening, that is. Ralph, are we in our right minds? Did your daughter-in-law take your earrings? Yes. Rose straightened. Yes, she did. No doubts. No. Then you've answered your own question. We are sane, all right, but I think you're wrong about the telepathy part. It isn't minds we read, but auras. Listen, Lois, there's all sorts of things I want to ask you, but I have an idea that right now there's only one thing I really have to know. Have you seen? He stopped abruptly, wondering if he really wanted to say what was on the tip of his tongue. Have I seen what? Okay, this is going to sound crazier than anything you've told me, but I'm not crazy. Do you believe that I'm not? I believe you, she said simply, and Ralph felt a vast weight slip from his heart. She was telling the truth. There was no question about it. Her belief shone all around her. Okay, listen. Since this started happening to you, have you seen certain people who don't look like they belong on Harris Avenue? People who don't look like they belong anywhere in the ordinary world. Lois was looking at him with puzzled incomprehension. They're bald, they're very short, they wear white smock tops, and what they look like more than anything are the drawings of space aliens they sometimes have on the front pages of those tabloid newspapers that they sell in the Red Apple. You haven't seen anyone like that when you've been having one of those hyper-reality attacks? No, no one. He banged a fist on his leg in frustration, thought for a moment, then looked up again. Monday morning, he said, before the cops showed up at Mrs. Loker's. Did you see me? Very slowly, Lois nodded her head. Her aura had darkened slightly, and spirals of scarlet, thin as threads, began to twist slowly up through it on a diagonal. I imagine you have a pretty good idea of who called the police then, Ralph said, don't you? Oh, I know it was you, Lois said in a small voice. I suspected before, but I wasn't sure until just now, until I saw it, in your colors. In my colors, he thought. It was what Ed had called them, too. But you didn't see 2 pint-sized versions of Mr. Clean come out of her house? No, she said, but that doesn't mean anything. I can't even see Mrs. Loker's house from my bedroom window. The Red Apple's roof was in the way. Ralph laced his hands together on top of his head. Of course it was. And he should have known it. The reason I thought you called the police is that just before I went to take a shower, I saw you looking at something through a pair of binoculars. I never saw you do that before, but I thought maybe you just wanted a better look at the stray dog who raids the garbage cans on Thursday mornings. She pointed down the hill. Him. Ralph grinned. That's no him. That's the gorgeous Rosalie. Oh, anyway, I was in the shower a long time because there's a special rinse I put in my hair. Not color, she said sharply, as if she had accused her of this. Just proteins and things that are supposed to keep it looking a little thicker. When I came out, the police were flocking all around. I looked over your way once, but I couldn't see you anymore. You'd either gone into a different room or kind of scrunched back in your chair. You do that sometimes. Ralph shook his head, as if to clear it. He hadn't been in an empty theater on all those nights after all. Someone else had been there too. They had just been in separate boxes. Lois, the fight Bill and I had wasn't really about chess. Down the hill, Rosalie voiced a rusty bark and began struggling to her feet. Ralph looked in that direction and felt an icicle slip into his belly. Although the two of them had been sitting near for going on half an hour and no one had even come near the comfort stations at the bottom of the hill, he pressed the plastic door of the portisan marked Men was now slowly opening. Drop number 3 emerged from it. McGovern's hat, the Panama with a crescent written in the brim, was cocked back on his head, making him look weirdly as McGovern had on the day that Ralph had seen him in his brown fedora, like an inquiring news hawk in a 40s crime drama. Upraised in one hand, and the bald stranger held the rusty scalpel. Chapter 13. Lois. To Ralph's own ears, his voice seemed to be an echo winding down a long, deep canyon. Lois, do you see that? I don't. Her voice broke off. Did the wind blow that bathroom door open? It didn't, did it? Someone there? Is that why the dog's making that racket? Rosalie backed slowly away from the bald man, her ragged ears laid back, her muzzle wrinkled to expose teeth so badly eroded that they were not much more menacing than the hard rubber pegs. She uttered a cracked volley of barks, then began to whine desperately. Yes, don't you see him? Lois, look, he's right there. Ralph got to his feet. Lois got up with him, shielding her eyes with one. She peered down the slope with desperate intensity. You see a shimmer, that's all, like the air over an incinerator. Told you to leave her alone, Ralph shouted down the hill. Quit it, get the hell out. The bald man looked in Ralph's direction, but there was no surprise in the glance this time. It was casual, dismissive. He raised the middle finger of his right hand, flicked it at Ralph in the ancient salute, then bared his own teeth, much sharper and much more menacing than Rosalie's, in a silent laugh. Rosalie cringed as the little man in dirty smock began to walk toward her again, then actually raised a paw and put it on her own head. A cartoonish gesture that should have been funny and was horribly expressive of her terror instead. "What can't I see, Ralph?" Lois moaned. "I see something, but—" "Get away from her!" Ralph shouted, and raised his hand in that karate chop gesture again. The hand inside, the hand which earlier had produced that wedge of tight blue light, still felt like an unloaded gun, however, and this time the bald doc seemed to know it. He glanced in Ralph's direction and offered a small jeering wave. "I'll quit it short. Sit back, shut up, and enjoy the show." The creature at the foot of the hill returned his attention to Rosalie, who sat huddled at the base of an old pine. The tree was emitting a thin green fog from the cracks in its bark. The bald doctor bent over Rosalie, one hand outstretched in a gesture of solicitude, and went very badly with his scalpel curled into his fist. Rosalie whined, then stretched her neck forward and humbly licked the bald creature's hand. Ralph looked down at his hands, sensing something in them. Not the power he'd had before, nothing like that, but something. Suddenly there were snaps of clear white light dancing just above his nails. It was as if his fingers had been turned into spark plugs. Lois was grabbing frantically at him now. "What's wrong with the dog, Ralph? Ralph, what's wrong with it?" With no thought about what he was doing or why, Ralph put his hands over Lois's eyes like someone playing Guess Who with a loved one. His fingers flashed a momentary white so bright it was almost blinding. Must be the white they're always talking about in the detergent commercials, he thought. Lois screamed. Her hands flew to his wrists, clamped on them, then loosened. "My God, Ralph, what did you do to me?" He took his hands away and saw a glowing figure surrounding her eyes. It was as if she had just taken off a pair of goggles, which had been dipped in confectioner's sugar. The white began to dim almost as soon as his hands were gone, except it's not dimming, he thought. It's sinking in. "Never mind," he said, and pointed. "Look." The widening of her eyes told him what he needed to know. Doc number 3, completely unmoved by Rosalie's desperate effort to make friends, shoved her muzzle aside, with a hand holding the scalpel. He seized the old bandana hanging around her neck in his other hand and yanked her up. Rosalie howled miserably. Slobber ran back along the sides of her face. The bald man voiced a scabrous chuckle that made Ralph's flesh crawl. "Hi, leave off! Leave off teasing that dog!" The bald man's head snapped around. The grin ran off his face, and he snarled at Lois, sounding a little like a dog himself. "Yeah, go fuck yourself, you old short-time cunt. The dog's mine, just like I already told your limp-dick boyfriend." The bald man had let go of the blue bandana when Lois shouted at him, and Rosalie was now cringing back against the pine again, her eyes rolling, curds of foam dripping from the sides of her muzzle. Ralph had never seen such a completely terrified creature in his life. "Run!" Ralph screamed. "Get away!" She seemed not to hear him, and after a moment, Ralph realized she wasn't hearing him, because Rosalie was no longer entirely there. The bald doctor had done something to her already. He had pulled her at least partway out of the ordinary reality, like a farmer, using his tractor and a length of chain to pull a stump. Ralph tried once more anyway. "Run, Rosalie, run away!" This time her laid-back ears cocked forward and her head began to turn in Ralph's direction. He didn't know if she would have obeyed him or not, because the bald man renewed his hold on the bandana before she could even begin to move. He yanked her head up again. "He's going to kill it," Lois screamed. "He's going to cut its throat with that thing he has. Don't let him, Ralph. Make him stop." "I can't. Maybe you can. Shoot him. Shoot your hand at him." She looked at him, not understanding. Ralph made frantic wood-chopping gestures with his right hand, But before Lois could respond, Rosalie gave a dreadful lost howl. The bald doc raised the scalpel and brought it down. But it wasn't Rosalie's throat that he cut. He cut her balloon string. Oh no. Section 2. A thread emerged from each of Rosalie's nostrils and floated upward. They twined together about 6 inches above her snout, making a delicate pigtail, and it was at this point that Baldy No. 3's scalpel did its work. Ralph watched, frozen with horror, as the severed pigtail rose into the sky, like the string of a released helium balloon. It was unraveling as it went. He thought it would tangle in the branches of the old pine, but it didn't. When the ascending balloon string finally did meet one of the branches, it simply passed through. Of course, Ralph thought. The same way this guy's buddies walked through May Loker's locked front door after they finished doing the same thing to her. This idea was followed by a thought too simple and gruesomely logical not to be believed. Not space aliens, not little bald doctors, but centurions. Ed Dipnew's centurions. They didn't look like the Roman soldiers you saw in tin pants epics like Spartacus and Ben-Hur, true, but they had to be centurions, didn't they? 16 or 20 feet above the ground, Rosalie's balloon string simply faded away to nothingness. Ralph looked back down in time to see the bald dwarf pull the faded blue bandana off over the dog's head and then push her down at the base of the tree. Ralph looked at her more closely and felt all his flesh shrink closer to his bones. His dream of Carolyn recurred with cruel intensity, and he found himself struggling to bottle up a shriek of terror. That's right, Ralph. Don't scream. You don't want to do that because once you start, you might not be able to stop. You might just go on doing it until your throat bursts. Remember Lois? Because she's in this now too. Remember Lois and don't start screaming. But it is hard not to because the dream bugs, which had come spewing out of Carolyn's head, were now pouring from Rosalie's nostrils in writhing black streams. Those aren't bugs. I don't know what they are, but they are not bugs. No, not bugs, just another kind of aura. Nightmarish black stuff, neither liquid nor gas, was pumping out of Rosalie with each exhaled breath. It did not float away, but instead began to surround her in slow, nasty coils of anti-light. Blackness should have hidden her from view, but it didn't. Ralph could see her pleading, terrified eyes as the darkness gathered around her head and then began to ooze down her back and sides and legs. It was a death bag, a real death bag this time, and he was watching as Rosalie, her balloon string now cut, wove it relentlessly about herself like a poisonous placental sac. This metaphor triggered the voice of Ed Dipnew inside his head. It sang that the centurions were ripping babies from the wombs of their mothers and taking them away in covered trucks. All right, we're going to stop right there and go to our first music break. On this break, we have the lovely and talented Miss Savage with her band Antidote for Savages. And she's going to be singing Our New Reality. That may be your home, your skeleton, and Lemurian crypto. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back after this music break.
Come with me to our reality. You don't need all the shit that he brings anymore. You're mine. You're mine. In a sea of broken hearts, won't let you fall apart. We'll make a brand new start. When you're coming back, I'm gonna take a ride. I wanna knock you down. Come with me to our new reality. You need all the shit that he brings anymore. You're mine. You're mine. Come with me to our new reality. You don't need all the shit that he brings anymore. You're mine. You're mine. You're mine. You're mine.
Welcome back, and thanks so much for hanging out with me tonight on We Are Paradox Media's Late Night in the Rockies. Tonight, we are reading Stephen King's book, Insomnia. Pretty interesting so far. What do you think? Ever wonder what was under those tarps? It asked. Duck number 3 stood grinning down at Rosalie. Then he untied the knot in her bandana and put it around his own neck, tying it in a big loose knot, making it look like a bohemian artist's necktie. This done, he looked up at Ralph and Lois with an expression of loathsome complacency. There, his look said. Took care of my business after all, and there wasn't a damn thing you could do about it, was there? Do something, Ralph. Please do something. Make him stop. Too late for that, but maybe not too late to send him packing before he could enjoy the sight of Rosalie dropping dead at the foot of the tree. I was pretty sure Lois couldn't produce a karate chop of blue light as he had done, but maybe he could do something else. Yes, she can shoot him in her own way. He didn't know why he was so sure of that, but suddenly he was. He grabbed Lois by the shoulders to make her look at him, then raised his right hand. He cocked his thumb and pointed his forefinger at the bald man. He looked like a small child playing cops and robbers. Lois responded with a look of dismay and incomprehension. Ralph grabbed her hand and stripped off her glove. You, Lois. She got the idea, raised her own hand, extended her forefinger, and made the child's shooting gesture. Pow, pow. Two compact lozenge shapes, their blue-gray shade identical to Lois's aura, but much brighter, flew from the end of her finger and streaked down the heel. Rock number 3 screeched and leaped upward. Fisted hands held at shoulder height, the heels of his black shoes clipping against his buttocks as the first of these bullets went under him. It struck the ground, rebounded like a flat stone, skipped across the surface of a pond, and hit the courtesan-marked women. For a moment, the entire front of it glowed fiercely, as the window of the Buffy had done. The only second blue pellet clipped the Baldy's left hip and ricocheted up into the sky. He screamed a high, chattery sound that seemed to twist like a worm in the middle of Ralph's head. Ralph raised his hands to his ears, even though it could do no good, and saw Lois doing the same. He felt sure that if that scream went on for long, it would burst his head open just as surely as high sea shatters fine crystal. Rock number 3 fell to the needle-carpeted ground beside Rosalie and rolled back and forth, howling and holding his hip the way a small child would hold the place he banged when he tumbled off his tricycle. After a few moments of this, his cries began to diminish, and he scrambled to his feet. His eyes blazed at them from below the white expanse of his brow. Bill's Panama was tilted far back on his head now, and the left side of his smock was black and smoking. I'll get you both. Goddamn interfering short-time fucks, I'll get you both. He rolled and bounded down the path which led to the playground and the tennis courts, running in big flying leaps like an astronaut on the moon. Lois's shot didn't appear to have done any real damage, judging by his speed of foot. Lois seized Ralph's shoulder and shook him. As she did, the aura began to fade again. The children, it's going toward the children. She was fading out, and that seemed to make perfect sense because he suddenly saw that Lois wasn't really talking at all, only staring at him fixedly with her dark eyes as she clutched his shoulders. I can't hear you, he yelled. Lois, I can't hear you. What's wrong? Are you deaf? It's going toward the playground, toward the children. We can't let it hurt the children. Ralph let out a deep, shuddering sigh. It won't. How can you be sure? I don't know. I just am. I shot it. She turned her finger toward her face for a moment, looking like a woman who mimes suicide. I shot it with my finger, looking like a woman who mimes. It stung him, too, hard from the way he looked. I can't see the colors anymore, Ralph. He nodded. We come and go like radio stations at night. I don't know how I feel. I don't even know how I want to feel. She wrote this last, and Ralph folded her into his arms. In spite of everything that was going on in his life right now, one fact registered very clearly. It was wonderful to be holding a woman again. That's okay, he told her and pressed his face against the top of her head. Her hair smelled sweet, with none of the underlying murk of beauty shop chemicals he'd gotten used to in Carolyn's hair over the last 10 or 15 years of her life together. Let go of it for now, okay? She looked at him. He could no longer see the faint mist drifting across her pupils, but felt sure it was still there, and besides, they were very pretty eyes even without the extra added attraction. What's it for, Ralph? Do you know what it's for? He shook his head. His mind was whirling with jigsaw pieces. Bats, docks, bugs, protest sign, dolls that exploded in splatters of fake blood. Would not fit together, and for the time being at least, the thing that seemed to recur with the most resonance was old Dora's nonsense, saying, "Dumb bone can't be undone." Ralph had an idea that was nothing but the truth. Section 3. I forgot to put my Insomnia guy up here. My pops were here. Yeah, gotta have Insomnia going on. I think this one could work. All right, let's try it out, shall we? Oops, wrong one. All right, there we go. I don't know how to make it bigger. Anyhow. All right, section 3. The sad little whine came to his ears, and Ralph looked down the hill. Rosalie was lying at the base of the big pine trying to get up. Ralph could no longer see the black dog around her, but he was sure it was still there. Oh, Ralph, the poor thing, what can we do? There was nothing they could do, Ralph was sure of it. He took Lois's right hand in both of his and waited for Rosalie to lie back and die. Instead of that, she gave a whole body lurch and sent her so strongly to her feet that she almost toppled over the other way. She stood still for a moment, her head held so low her muzzle was almost on the ground, and then sneezed 3 or 4 times. With that out of the way, she shook herself and looked up at Ralph and Lois. She yapped at them once, a short, brisk sound. To Ralph, it sounded as if she were telling them to quit worrying. Then she turned and made off through a little grove of pine trees towards the park's lower entrance. Before Ralph lost sight of her, she had achieved the limping yet insouciant trot, which was her trademark. The bone leg was no better than it had been before Doc Number 3's interference, but it seemed no worse. Clearly old, but seemingly a long way from dead, just like the rest of the Harris Avenue old crocs, Ralph thought. She disappeared into the trees. I thought that thing was going to kill her, Lois said. In fact, I thought it had killed her. Me too, Ralph said. Ralph, did all that really happen? It did, didn't it? Yes. The woolen strings, do you think they're lifelines? She nodded slowly. Less like umbilical cords and Rosalie. He thought back for his first real experience with the auras of how he'd stood outside the Rite Aid with his back to the blue mailbox and his jaw hanging down almost to his breastbone. Of the 60 or 70 people he had observed before the auras faded again, only a few had been walking inside the dark envelopes he now thought of as death bags, and the one Rosalie had knitted around herself just now had been blacker, by far, than any he had seen that day. Still, those people in the parking lot, whose auras had been dingy dark, had invariably looked unwell, like Rosalie, whose aura had been the color of the old sweat socks even before Baldy Number 3 started messing with her. Maybe he just hurried up what may otherwise be perfectly natural process, he thought. Ralph, Lois asked, what about Rosalie? I think my old friend Rosalie is living on borrowed time now, Ralph said. Lois considered this, looking down the hill and into the sun-dusty grove where Rosalie had disappeared. At last she turned to Ralph again. That midget with a scalpel was one of the men you saw coming out of Mary Loker's house, wasn't he? No, those were 2 other ones. Have you seen more? No. Do you think there are more? I don't know. He had an idea that next she'd ask if Ralph had noticed that the creature had been wearing Bill's Panama, but she didn't. Ralph supposed it was possible she hadn't recognized it. Too much weirdness swirling around, and besides, there hadn't been a chunk bitten out of the brim the last time she'd been seeing Bill wearing it. Tired history teachers just aren't the hat-biting type, he reflected, and grinned. This has been quite a morning, Ralph. Lois met his gaze frankly, eye to eye. We need to talk about this, don't you? I really need to know what's going on. Ralph remembered this morning 1,000 years ago, now walking back down the street from the picnic area, running over his short list of acquaintances, trying to decide whom he should talk to. He had crossed Lois off that mental list on the grounds that she might gossip to her girlfriends, and he was now embarrassed by the facile judgment which had been based on McGovern's picture of Lois than on his own. Turned out that the only person Lois had spoken to about the auras before today was the one person she should have been able to trust to keep her secret. He nodded at her. "You're right. We need to talk. Would you like to come back to my house for a little late lunch? I make a pretty mean stir-fry for an old gal who can't keep track of her earrings." "I'd love to. I'll tell you what I know, but it's going to take a while. When I talked to Bill this morning, I gave him the Reader's Digest version." "So," Lois said, "the fight wasn't about chess, was it?" "Well, maybe not," Ralph said, smiling down at his hands. "Maybe it was actually more like the fight you had with your son and your daughter-in-law, and I didn't even tell him the craziest parts." "But you'll tell me?" "Yes," he said, and started to get up. "I'll bet you're a hell of a good cook, too, in fact." He stopped suddenly and clapped one hand to his chest. He sat back down on the bench heavily, his eyes wide and his mouth ajar. "Ralph, are you all right?" Her alarmed voice seemed to be coming from a great distance. In his mind's eye, he was seeing Baldy number 3 again, standing between Buffy and the apartment house next door. Baldy number 3 trying to get Rosalie to cross Harris Avenue so he could cut her balloon string. He'd failed then, but he'd gotten the job done. I was going to play with her before that morning was out. Maybe the fact that Bill McGovern isn't the hat-biting type wasn't the only reason Lois didn't notice whose hat Baldy number 3 was wearing. Ralph, old buddy, maybe she didn't notice because she didn't want to notice. Maybe there were a couple of pieces here that fit together, and if you're right about that, the implications are wide-ranging. You see that, don't you? "Ralph, what's wrong?" He saw the dwarf snatching a bite from the brim of the Panama and then clapped it back on his head. Heard him saying he guessed he would have to play with Ralph instead. "But not just me and my friends," he said. "Me and my asshole friends." Now thinking back on it, he saw something else as well. He saw the sun striking splinters of fire from the lobes of Doc number 3's ears as he, or it, bumped into the brim of McGovern's hat. The memory was too clear to deny, and so were those implications. Those wide-ranging implications. Take it easy. You don't know a thing for sure, and the funny farm is just over the horizon, my friend. But I think you need to remember that and maybe use it as an anchor. I don't care if Lois is also seeing all this stuff or not. The other men in the white coats, not the pint-sized Baldies, but the muscular guys with the butterfly nets and the Thorazine shots, can show up at any time, any old time at all. But still, Ralph, Jesus Christ, talk to me. Lois was shaking him now, and shaking hard like a wife trying to rouse a husband who was going to be late for work. He looked around at her and tried to manufacture a smile. It felt false from inside, but must have looked all right to Lois because she relaxed. A little, anyway. "Sorry," he said. "For a few seconds there, it all just sort of, ganged up on me." "Don't you scare me like that. The way you grabbed your chest, my God." "I'm fine," Ralph said, and forced his false smile even wider. He felt like a kid pulling a wad of silly putty, seeing how far he could stretch it before it thinned enough to tear. "And if you are still cooking, I'm still eating." 369, hun. The goose drank wine. Lois took a close look at him and then relaxed. "Good, that would be fun. I haven't cooked for anyone but Simone and Mina. They're my girlfriends, in a long time." Don't you laugh, except that isn't what I mean. That isn't why it would be, fun. "What do you mean?" "Well, that I haven't cooked for a man in a long time. I hope I haven't forgotten how." "Well, there was the day that Bill and I came in to watch the news with you. We had macaroni and cheese. It was good, too." She made a dismissive gesture. Reheated, not the same. The monkey chewed tobacco on the streetcar line. The line broke, smiling wider than ever, waiting for the rips to start. "I'm sure you haven't forgotten how, Lois." Mr. Chase had a very hearty appetite, all sorts of hearty appetites, in fact. Then he started having his liver trouble, and she sighed, then reached for Ralph's arm and took it with a mixture of timidity, and resolution he found completely endearing. Never mind. I'm tired of sniveling and moaning about the past. I'll leave that to Bill. Let's go. He stood up, linking his arm through hers, and walked her down the hill toward the lower entrance to the park. Lois beamed blindingly at the young mothers in the playground as she and Ralph passed them. Ralph was glad for the distraction, but he would tell himself to withhold judgment. He could remind himself over and over again that he didn't know enough about what was happening to him and Lois to even kid himself that he could think logically about it, but he kept jumping at the conclusion anyway. The conclusion felt right to his heart, and he had already come a long way toward believing that, in the world of auras, feeling and knowing were close to identical. I don't know about the other two, but number 3 is one crazy medic, and he takes souvenirs. It's some of the way some of the crazies in Vietnam took ears. That Lois's daughter-in-law had given in to an evil impulse, skipping the diamond earrings from the china dish and putting them in her pocket. He had no doubt about that, but Janet Chase no longer had them, and even now she was no doubt reproaching herself bitterly for having lost them and wondering why she had never taken them in the first place. Ralph knew the shrimp with a scalpel had McGovern's hat, even if Lois had failed to recognize it, and they both had seen him take Rosalie's bandana. What Ralph had realized as he started to get up from the bench was that those splinters of light he had seen reflecting from the bald creature's earlobes almost certainly meant that Doc Number 3 had Lois's earrings as well. Section 4. The light Mr. Chase's rocking chair stood on faded linoleum by the door at the back porch. Lois led Ralph to it and admonished him to stay out from underfoot. Ralph thought this was an assignment he could handle. Strong light, mid-afternoon light, fell across his lap as he sat and rocked. Ralph wasn't sure how it had gotten so late so fast, but somehow it had. Maybe I fell asleep, he thought. Maybe I'm asleep right now and dreaming all this. He watched as Lois took down a wok, definitely hobbit-sized, from an overhead cupboard. 5 minutes later, savory smells began to fill the kitchen. I told you I cooked for you someday, Lois said, adding vegetables from the fridge crisper and spices from one of the overhead cabinets. It's the same day I gave you and Bill leftover macaroni and cheese, do you remember? I believe I do, Ralph said, smiling. There's a jug of fresh cider in the milk box on the front porch. Cider always keeps best outside. Would you get it? Can you pour out too? Huh. You can pour out too. My good glasses are in the cupboard over the sink, and one I can't reach without dragging over a chair. You were tall enough to do without the chair, I judge. What are you, Ralph? About 6'2"? 6'3" at least I was, I guess. Maybe I've lost an inch or two in the last 10 years. Your spine settles or something, and you don't have to go putting on the dog just for me, honest. She looked at him levelly, hands on hips, and spoon, with which she had been stirring the contents of the wok, jutting from one of them. Her severity was offset by the trace of a smile. I said my good glasses, Ralph Roberts, not my best glasses. Yes, ma'am, he said, grinning, then added, from the way that smells, I guess you still remember how to cook for a man. The proof of the pudding is in the eating, Lois replied, but Ralph thought she looked pleased as she turned back the wok. Food was good, and they didn't talk about what had happened in the park as they applied themselves to it. Ralph's appetite had become uncertain, out more often than in, since his insomnia had really begun to bite, but today he ate heartily and chased Lois's spicy stir-fry with 3 glasses of apple cider. Hoping uneasily as he finished the last one that the rest of the day's activities wouldn't take him too far from a toilet. When they had finished, Lois got up, went to the sink, and began to draw hot water for dishes. As she did, she resumed their earlier conversation as if it were a half-finished piece of knitting, which had been temporarily laid aside for some other, more pressing chore. What did you do to me? She asked him. What did you do to make the colors come back? I don't know. It was as if I was on the edge of that world, and when you put your hands over my eyes, you pushed me into it. She nodded, remembering how she'd looked in the first few seconds after he'd removed his hands, as if she'd just taken off a pair of goggles, which had been dipped in powdered sugar. It was pure instinct, and you're right, it is like a world. I keep thinking of it just that way, as the world of auras. It's wonderful, isn't it? I mean, it's scary, and when it first started to happen to me back in late July or early August I was sure I was going crazy, but even then I liked it too. I couldn't help liking it. Ralph gazed at her, startled. Had he once upon a time thought of Lois as transparent, gossipy, and able to keep a secret? No, I'm afraid it was a little worse than that, old buddy. You thought she was shallow. You saw her pretty much through Bill's eyes, as a matter of fact, as our Lois. No less, but not much more. What? She asked a little uneasily. Why are you looking at me like that? You've been seeing these auras since summer? That long? Yes, brighter and brighter. Also more often. That's why I finally went to see the Tattletale. Did I really shoot that thing with my finger, Ralph? The more time goes by, the less I can believe that part of it. You did. I did something like that myself shortly before I ran into you. He told her about his earlier confrontation with Doc Number 3 and about how he had banished the dwarf, temporarily at least. He raised his hand to his shoulder and brought it swiftly down. That's all I did, like a kid pretending to be Chuck Norris or Steven Seagal, but it sent this incredible bolt of blue light at him, and he scurried in a hurry, which was probably for the best because I couldn't have done it again. I don't know how I did that, either. Could you have shot your finger again? Lois giggled, turned toward him, and cocked her finger in his general direction. Want to find out? Wow, kablam! Don't point that thing at me, lady, Ralph told her. He smiled as he said it, but wasn't entirely sure he was joking. Lois lowered her finger and squirted joy into the sink. As she began to stir the water around with one hand, puffing up the suds, she asked what Ralph thought of as the big questions. Where did this power come from, Ralph, and what's it for? He shook his head as he got up and walked over to the dish drainer. I don't know, and I don't know. How's that for helpful? Where do you keep your dish wipers, Lois? Never mind where I keep my dish wipers. Go sit down. Please tell me you are not one of those modern men, Ralph. The ones that are always hugging each other and bawling. Ralph laughed and shook his head. Nope. I was just well trained, that's all. Okay, well, as long as you don't start going on about how sensitive you are, there are some things a girl likes to find out for herself. She opened the cupboard under the sink and tossed him a faded but scrupulously clean dish towel. Just dry them and put them on the counter. I'll put them away myself. While you're working, you can tell me your story. The unabridged version. You got a deal. He was still wondering where to begin when his mouth opened seemingly of its own accord and began for him. When I finally started to get it through my head that Carolyn was going to die, I went for a lot of walks, and one day while I was out on the extension... Section 6. He told her everything, beginning with his intervention between Ed and the fat man wearing the West Side Gardener's guinea cap, and ending with Bill telling him that he'd better go see his doctor because at their age, mental illness was common. At their age, it was common as hell. He had to double back several times to pick up dropped stitches, the way old Thor had showed up in the middle of his efforts to keep Ed from going with the man from West Side Gardeners, for instance. But he didn't mind doing that, and Lois didn't seem to have any trouble keeping his narrative straighter either. The overall feeling Ralph was conscious of was he wound his way through his tale as a relief so deep it was nearly painful. It was as if someone had stacked bricks on his heart and mind, and he was now removing them one by one. By the time he was finished, the dishes were done, and they had left the kitchen in favor of the living room, with its dozens of framed photographs. Presided over by Mr. Chase from his place on the TV. So, Ralph said, how much of it do you believe? Well, all of it, of course, she said, and either did not notice the expression of relief on Ralph's face or choose to ignore it. After what we saw this morning, not to mention what you knew about my wonderful daughter-in-law, I can't very well not believe. That's my advantage over Bill. Not your only one, Ralph thought, but didn't say. None of this stuff is coincidental, is it? She asked him. Ralph shook his head. No, I don't think so. When I was 17, she said, my mother hired this boy from down the road. Richard Henderson, his name was. To do chores around our place. There were a lot of boys she could have hired, but she hired Richie because she liked him, and she liked him for me, if you understand what I mean. Of course I do. She was matchmaking. But at least she wasn't doing it in a big, gruesome, embarrassing way, thank God, because I didn't care a fig for Richie, at least not like that. So Mother gave it her very best. If I was studying my books at the kitchen table, she'd have him loading the wood box even though it was May and already hot. If I was feeding the chickens, she'd have Richie cutting side hay next to the dooryard. She wanted me to see him around to get used to him. And if we got to like each other's company and he asked me to a dance or the town fair, that would have been just fine with her. It was gentle, but it was there. A push, and that's what this is like. The pushes don't feel all that gentle to me, Ralph said. His hand went involuntarily to the place where Charlie Pickering had pricked him with the point of his knife. No, of course they don't. Having a man stick a knife in your ribs like that must have been horrible. Thank God you had that spray can. Do you suppose old Doris sees the auras too? That something from that world told him to put the can in your pocket? Ralph gave a helpless shrug. What she was suggesting had crossed his mind, but once you got beyond it, the ground really started to slope away. Because if Florence had done that, it suggested that some entity, force, or being had known that Ralph would need help. Nor was that all. That force or being would also have had to know that A, Ralph would be going out on Sunday afternoon, that B, the weather, quite nice up until then, would turn nasty enough to require a jacket, and C, which jacket he would wear. You were talking, in other words, about something that could foretell the future. The idea that he had been noticed by such a force frankly scared the hell out of him. He recognized that, in the case of the aerosol can, at least the intervention had probably saved his life, but it still scared the hell out of him. Maybe, he said, maybe something did use Dorrance as an errand boy, but why? What do we do now? She added. Ralph could only shake his head. She glanced up at the clock, squeezed in between the picture of the man in the raccoon coat and the young woman who looked ready to say, 23 skidoo, any old time, then reached for the phone. Almost 3:30, my goodness. Ralph touched her hand. Who are you calling? Simone Gastonbury. I'd made plans to go over to Ludlow with her and Nina this afternoon. There's a card party at the Grange. But I can't go after all this. I'd lose my shirt. She laughed and colored prettily. Just a figure of speech. Ralph put his hand over hers before she could lift the receiver. Go on to your card party, Lois. Really? She looked both doubtful and a little disappointed. Yes. He was still unclear about what was going on here, but he sensed that was about to change. Lois had spoken of being pushed, but to Ralph it felt more as if he were being carried, the way a river carries a man in a small boat. But he couldn't see where he was going. Heavy mist shrouded the banks, and now, as the current began to grow swifter, he could hear the rumble of rapids somewhere up ahead. Still, there are shapes, Ralph, shapes in the mist. Yes, not very comforting ones either. They might be trees that only look like clutching fingers, but on the other hand, they might be clutching fingers trying to look like trees. Until Ralph knew which was the case, he liked the idea of Lois's being out of town just fine. He had a strong intuition, or perhaps it was only hope masquerading as intuition. But Doc number 3 couldn't follow her to Ludlow, that he might not even be able to follow her across the barrens to the east side. You can't know any such thing, Ralph. Maybe not, but it felt right, and he was still convinced that in the world of auras, feeling and knowing were pretty nearly the same thing. One thing he did know was that Doc number 3 hadn't cut Lois's balloon string yet, that Ralph had seen for himself along with the joyously healthy gray glow of her aura. Yet Ralph could not escape a growing certainty that Doc number 3, Crazy Doc, intended to cut it, and that no matter how lively Rosalie had looked when she went trotting away from Strawford Park, the severing of that cord was a moral, murderous act. Let's say you're right, Ralph. Let's say he can't get at her this afternoon if she's playing nickel and dime out in Ludlow. Tonight, tomorrow, next week. What's the solution? Does she call up her son and her bitch of a daughter-in-law, tell him she's changed her mind about Riverview Estates and wants to go there after all? He didn't know, but he knew he needed time to think, and he also knew that constructive thinking would be hard to do until he was fairly sure that Lois was safe, at least for a while. Ralph, you're getting that Moogie look again. What look? Moogie. She tossed her hair prettily. That's a word I made up to describe how Mr. Chase looked when he was pretending to listen to me but was actually thinking about his coin collection. I know a Moogie look when I see one, Ralph. What are you thinking about? I was wondering what time you think you'll get back from your card game. That depends. On what? On whether or not we stop at Tubi's for chocolate frites. With the air of a woman revealing a secret vice. Suppose you come straight back. 7 o'clock, maybe 7:30. Tell me as soon as you get home. Would you do that? Yes, you want me out of town, don't you? That's what that Moogie look really means. Well, you think that nasty bald thing means to hurt me, don't you? And I think it's a possibility. Well, he might hurt you too. Yes, but so far as I can tell, Lois, he's not wearing any of my fashion accessories. But what? I'm going to be okay until you get back, that's all. He remembered her deprecating remark about modern men hugging each other and bawling and tried for a masterful frown. Go play cards and leave this business to me, at least for the time being, and that's an order. Carolyn would have either laughed or gotten angry at such comic opera macho posturing. Lois, who belonged to an entirely different school of feminine thought, only nodded and looked grateful to have the decision taken out of her hands. All right, she tilted his chin down as she could look directly into his eyes. You know what you're doing, Ralph? Nope, not yet, anyway. All right, just as long as you admit it. She placed a hand on his forearm and a soft, open-mouthed kiss on the corner of his mouth. Ralph felt an entirely welcome prickle of heat in his groin. I'll go to Ludlow and win $5 playing poker with those silly women who are always trying to fill their inside straights. Tonight we'll talk about what to do next, okay? Yeah. Her small smile, nothing more in the eyes than of the mouth, suggested that they might do a little more than just talk if Ralph was bold, and at that moment he felt quite bold indeed. Not even Mr. Chase's stern gaze from his place atop the TV affected that feeling very much. Chapter 14. Section 1. It was 3:45 by the time Ralph crossed the street and walked the short distance back the hill to his own building. Dryness was stealing over him again. He felt as if he had been up for roughly 3 centuries, yet at the same time he felt better than he had since Carolyn had died. More together, more himself. Or is that maybe just what you want to believe, that a person can't feel this miserable without some sort of positive payback? It's a lovely idea, Ralph, but not very realistic. All right, he thought, so maybe I'm a little confused right now. Indeed he was, also frightened, exhilarated, disoriented, and a touch horny. Yet one clear idea came through this mix of emotions. One thing he needed to do before he did anything else. He had to make up with Bill. If that meant apologizing, he could do that. Maybe an apology was even in order. Bill, after all, hadn't come to him saying, "Gee, old buddy, you look terrible. Tell me all about it." No, he had gone to Bill. He had done so with misgivings, true, but that didn't change the fact, Anne. "Ah, Ralph, geez, what am I going to do with you?" It was Carolyn's amused voice, speaking to him as clearly as it had been during the weeks following her death. When he'd handled the worst of his grief by discussing everything with her inside his head, and sometimes aloud if he happened to be alone in the apartment, Bill was the one who blew his top. "Sweetie, not you. I see you're just as determined to be hard on yourself now as you were when I was alive. I guess some things never change." Ralph smiled a little. "Yeah, okay, maybe some things never did change, and maybe the argument had been more Bill's fault than his. The question was whether or not he wanted to cut himself off from Bill's companionship over a stupid quarrel and a lot of stiff-necked horseshit about who had been right and who had been wrong. Ralph didn't think he did, and if that meant making an apology, Bill didn't really deserve what was so awful about that. So far as he knew. Oh, man. Sorry, my phone was ringing. Okay. Where was I? So far as he knew, there were no bones in the three little syllables that made up "I'm sorry." Carolyn inside his head responded to this idea with wordless incredulity. The Carolyn inside his head responded to this idea with wordless incredulity. "Never mind," he told her as he started up the walk. "I'm doing this for me, not for him. Or for you, as far as that goes." I was amazed and amused to discover how guilty that last thought made him feel, as if he had committed an act of sacrilege, but that didn't make the thought any less true. Note thumbtacked to the door. So he was feeling around in his pocket for his latchkey when he saw a note thumbtacked to the door. Ralph felt for his glasses, but he had left them upstairs on the kitchen table. He leaned back, squinting to read Bill's sprawling hand. "Dear Ralph, Lois, Fay, whoever, I expect to be spending most of the day at Derry Home. Bob Polhurst's niece called and told me that this time it's almost certainly the real thing. The poor man was almost finished his struggling. Room 313 in Derry Home ICU is about the last place on earth I want to be on a beautiful day in October, but I guess I'd better see this through to the end. Ralph, I'm sorry I gave you such a hard time this morning. You came to me for help, and I damn near clawed your face off instead. All I can say by way of apology is that this thing with Bob has completely wrecked my nerves. Okay, I think I owe you a dinner, if you still want to eat, with the likes of me, that is. Faye, please, 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 quit bugging me about your damn chess tournament. I promised I'd play, and I keep my promises. Goodbye, cruel world. Bill. Kyle straightened up with a feeling of relief and gratitude. If only everything else that had been happening to him lately could straighten itself out as easily as this part had done. He went upstairs, shook the tea kettle, and was filling it at the sink when the telephone rang. It was John Lydecker. "Boy, I'm glad I finally got a hold of you," he said. "I was getting a little worried, old buddy." "Why?" Ralph asked. "What's wrong?" "Maybe nothing. Maybe something. Charlie Pickering made Bell after all." "You told me that wouldn't happen." "I was wrong, okay?" Lydecker said, clearly irritated. "It wasn't the only thing I was wrong about either. I told you that the judge had probably set Bell in the $40,000 range, but I didn't know Pickering was going to draw Judge Steedman, who has been known to say that he doesn't even believe in insanity. Steedman sent Bell at $80,000. Pickering's court appointment bellowed like a calf in the moonlight, but it didn't make any difference." Ralph looked down and saw he was still holding the tea kettle in one hand. He put it on the table. "And he still made Bell?" "Yep. Remember me telling you that Ed would throw him away like a paring knife with a broken blade?" "Yes." "Well, score it as another strikeout for John Lydecker." Ed marched into the bailiff's office at 11 o'clock this morning with a briefcase full of money. $8,000? Ralph asked. I said briefcase, not envelope, Lidecker replied. Not 8, but 80. They're still buzzing down at the courthouse. Hell, they'll be buzzing about that even after the Christmas tinsel comes down. Ralph tried to imagine Ed Dipnew in one of his baggy old sweaters and a pair of worn corduroys. Ed's mad scientist outfits, Carolyn had called them, pulling bent stacks of 20s and 50s out of his briefcase, and couldn't do it. Thought you said 10% was enough to get out. It is if he can also escrow something, a house or a piece of property, for instance. That stacks up somewhere near the total bail amount. Apparently, Ed couldn't do that. Sorry, my phone keeps ringing. But he did have a little rainy day cash under the mattress. Either that or he gave the tooth fairy one hell of a blowjob. Ralph found himself remembering the letter he had gotten from Helen about a week after she had left the hospital and moved out of High Ridge. She had mentioned a check she'd gotten from Ed, $750. Seems to indicate he understands his responsibilities. She had written, Ralph wondered if Helen would still feel that way if she knew that Ed had walked into the Derry County Courthouse with enough money to send his daughter sailing through the first 15 years of her life, and pledged it to free a crazy guy who liked to play with knives and Molotov cocktails. Where in God's name did he get it? He asked Lidecker. Don't know. And he isn't required to say? Nope, it's a free country. I understand he said something about cashing in some stocks. All right, we're going to have to stop there and go to our second music break. On this break, we have the lovely and talented Miss Mia Savage with her group Antidote for Savages. And let's see here. Oh, no worries. Oh, yeah. It's been like that. Like, everybody's been drained and tired. I think it's just winter. That's what happens, I suppose. All right, so she's going to be singing to Your Grave, Bury Me in Heaven, The Bottom Line, and Not a Phase. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back after this music break.
to your back. Saying to your back. So mad, yeah. I've been talking to your dad. I'm singing to your past.
Until I found you, I thought the same.
Kill the guys find something. Some of the demons run around. But it doesn't matter, because it's just a ride. Just come. Go back. No job. No savings tomorrow. Just a choice right now. Just a choice right now. Between fear and love.
You're feeling this for nothing. Me help you understand. I know I care. Leave me for days. This love is not fake. I know I can't be your taste. I don't know where I'm fake. Love is not fake.
If it ain't one thing, it's damn another. So, sorry about the music. I don't know why it's not working. I need to just go back through my system and check everything out and see what's what. Everything looks normal, so I don't know. Here's back to our book. Insomnia by Stephen King. I believe we're on chapter 13. Where in God's name did he get it? He asked Lydecker. Oh no. And he isn't required to say? Nope, it's free country. I understand he said something about cashing in some stocks. Ralph thought back to the old days, the good old days, before Carolyn had gotten sick and died and Ed had just gotten sick. Thought back to meals the four of them had had together once every 2 weeks or so. Take out pizza at Tip News or maybe Carol's chicken pot pie in Roberts's kitchen. And remembered Ed saying on one occasion that he was going to treat them all to prime rib at the Red Lion in Bangor when his stock accounts matured. That's right. Helen had replied, smiling at Ed fondly. She had been pregnant then, just beginning to show, and looking all of 14 with her hair pulled back in a ponytail and wearing a checkered smock that was still yards too big for her. Which do you think will mature first, Edward? The 2,000 shares of United Toe Jam or the 6,000 of Amalgamado Sour Balls? And he growled at her, a growl that had made them all laugh because Ed knew didn't have a mean bone in his body. Anyone who had known him more than 2 weeks knew that Ed wouldn't hurt a fly. Except Helen might have known a little different. Even back then, Helen had almost surely known a little different. Fond look or no fond look. Ralph, Lydecker asked, are you still there? Ed didn't have any stocks, Ralph said. He was a research chemist, for Christ's sake, and his father was foreman in a bottling plant in some crazy place like Plaster Rock, Pennsylvania. No dough there. Hold on, sorry. Just trying something real quick. Well, he got it somewhere, and I'd be lying if I said I liked it. From the other friends of life, do you think? No, I don't. First, we're not talking rich folks here. Most of the people who belong to the Friends are blue-collar types, working-class heroes. They give what they can, but this much, no. They could have gotten together enough property deeds among them to spring Pickering, I suppose, but they didn't. Most of them wouldn't even if Ed had passed. Ed's all but persona non grata with them now, and I imagine they wish they'd never heard of Charlie Pickering. Dan Dalton's taken back the leadership of the Friends of Life, and to most of them that's a big relief. Ed and Charlie and two other people. A man named Frank Felton and a woman named Sandra McKay seem to be operating very much on their own hook now. Felton, I don't know anything about that, and there's no jacket on him, but the McKay woman has toured some of the same fine institutions as Charlie. She's unmissable, too. Pasty complexion, lots of acne, glasses so thick they make her eyes look like poached eggs. Goes about 300 pounds. You joking? No, she favors stretch pants from Kmart and can usually be observed traveling in the company of assorted ding-dongs, funny bones, and hostess Twinkies. She often wears a big sweatshirt with the words Baby Factory on the front. Claims to have given birth to 15 children. She never actually had any and probably can't. Why are you telling me this? Because I want you to watch out for these people, Lydecker said. He spoke patiently, as if to a child. They may be dangerous. Charlie is for sure. That you know without me telling you. And Charlie is out. Where Ed got the money to spring them is secondary. He got it. That's what matters. I wouldn't be a bit surprised if he came after you again, him or Ed or the others. What about Helen and Natalie? They're with their friends who are very hip to the dangers posed by screw-loose hubbies. I filled Mike Hanlon in, and he'll also keep an eye on her. The library is being watched very closely by our men. We don't think Helen's in any real danger at the present time. She's still staying at High Ridge, but we're doing what we can. Thank you, John. I appreciate that, and I appreciate the call. I appreciate that you appreciate it, but I'm not quite done yet. You need to remember who Ed called and threatened, my friend. Not Helen, but you. She doesn't seem to be much of a concern to him anymore, but you linger on his mind, Ralph. I asked Chief Johnson if I could assign a man. Chris Nell would be my pick, to keep an eye on you, at least until after Women's Care Rent-A-Bitch has come and gone. I was turned down too much going on this week, he said, but the way I was turned down suggests to me that if you asked, you'd get someone to watch your back, so what do you say? Can he stalk someone else? Damn it all. Police protection, Ralph thought. That's what they call it on the TV cop shows, and that's what he's talking about. Police protection. He tried to consider the idea, but too many other things got in the way. They danced in his head like weird sugar plums. Hats, docks, smocks, break hands. Not to mention knives, scalpels, and a pair of scissors glimpsed in the dusty lenses of his old binoculars. Each thing I do, I rush through so I can do something else, Ralph thought. And on the heels of that, it's a long walk back to Eden, sweetheart, so don't sweat the small stuff. No, he said. What? Ralph closed his eyes and saw himself picking up the same phone and calling to cancel his appointment with the pen sticker man. This was the same thing all over again, wasn't it? Yes, he could get police protection from the Pickerings and the McKays and the Feltons, but it wasn't the way this was supposed to go. He knew that, felt it in every beat of his heart and pulse of his blood. You heard me, he said. I don't want police protection. For God's sake, why? I can take care of myself, Ralph said, and grimaced a little at the pompous absurdity of this sentiment, which he had heard expressed in John Wayne westerns without number. Ralph, I hate to be the one to break the news to you, but you're old. You got lucky on Sunday. You might get lucky again. I didn't just get lucky, Ralph thought. I've got friends in high places, or maybe I should say entities in high places. I'll be okay, he said. Lydecker sighed. Well, if you change your mind, will you call me? Yes. And if you see either Pickering or a large lady with thick glasses and stringy blonde hair hanging around, I'll call you. Ralph, please think this over. Just a guy parked down the street is all I'm talking about. Done bun can't be undone, Ralph said. Huh? I said I appreciate it, but no. I'll be talking to you. Ralph gently replaced the telephone in its cradle. Probably John was right, he thought. Probably he was crazy, yet he'd never felt so completely sane in his life. Tired, he told the sunny, empty kitchen. Sane. He paused and added, also halfway to being in love, maybe. That made him grin, and he was still grinning when he finally put the kettle on to heat. Section 2. It was on his second cup of tea when he remembered what Bill had said in his note about owing him a meal. He decided on the spur of the moment to ask Bill to meet him at daybreak, sundown, for a little supper. We could start over. I think we have to start over, he thought, because that little psycho has got his hat, and I'm pretty sure that means he's in trouble. Well, no time like the present. He picked up the phone and dialed a number he had no trouble remembering, 941-5000, the number of Dairy Home Hospital. Section 3. The hospital receptionist connected him with room 313. The clearly tired woman who answered the phone was Denise Polhurst, the dying man's niece. Bill wasn't there, she told him, for other teachers from that she had termed Explorer Days had shown up around 1, and Bill had proposed lunch. Ralph even knew how his downstairs tenant would have put it. Better belated than never. It was one of his favorites. When Ralph asked if she expected him back soon, Denise Polhurst said she did. He's been so faithful, I don't know what I would have done without him, Mr. Robbins. Roberts, he said. You made Mr. Polhurst sound like a wonderful man. Yes, they all feel that way, but of course the Bills won't be coming to his fan club, will they? No, Ralph said uncomfortably. I suppose not. Bill's note said, your uncle is very low? Yes, the doctor says he probably won't last the day, let alone the night, but I've heard that song before. God forgive me, but sometimes it's like Uncle Bob's one of those ads from Publishers Clearinghouse. Always promising, never delivering. I suppose that sounds awful, but I'm too tired to care. I turned off the life support stuff this morning. I couldn't have taken the responsibility all by myself, but I called Bill and he said that it was what Unc would have wanted. It's time for Bob to explore the next world, he said. He's mapped this one to the nicety. Isn't that poetic, Mr. Robbins? Yes, and it's Roberts, Mrs. Polhurst. Can you tell Bill that Ralph Roberts called and would like him to call back? So he turned it off, and I was all prepared, nerved up, I guess you'd say, and then he didn't die. I can't understand it. He's ready, I'm ready. His life's work is done, so why won't he die? I don't know. Death is very stupid, she said, speaking in the nagging and unlovely voice which only the very tired and deeply heartsick seem to enjoy. An obstetrician this slow in cutting a baby's umbilical cord would be fired for malpractice. Ralph's mind had a tendency to drift these days, but this time it snapped back in a hurry. What did you say? Beg your pardon? She sounded startled, as if her own mind had been drifting. You said something about cutting the cord. I didn't mean anything, she said. That nagging tone had grown stronger, except for it wasn't nagging, Ralph realized. It was whining and it was frightened. Something was wrong here. His heartbeat suddenly speeded up. I didn't mean anything at all, she insisted, and suddenly the phone Ralph was holding turned a deep and sinister shade of blue in his hand. She's been thinking about killing him, and not just idly either. She's been thinking about putting a pillow over his face and smothering him with it. It wouldn't take long, she thinks. A mercy, she thinks. Over at last, she thinks. Ralph pulled the phone away from his ear. Blue light, cold as a February sky, rose in pencil-thin rays from the holes in the earpiece. Murder is blue, Ralph thought, holding the phone at arm's length and staring with wide-eyed unbelief as the blue rays began to bend and drip toward the ground. He could hear very faintly the quacking anxious voice of Denise Paulhurst. It wasn't anything I ever wanted to know, but I guess I know it anyway. Murder is blue. He caught the handset. He brought the handset toward his mouth again, knocking it to keep the top half with its frayed of icicle aura away from him. He was afraid that if that end of the handset got too close to his ear, it might deafen him with her cold and furious desperation. "Tell Bill that Ralph called," he said. "Roberts, not Robbins." He hung up without waiting for a reply. The blue rays shattered away from the phone's earpiece and tumbled toward the floor. Ralph was again reminded of bicycles, this time of how they fell in a neat row when you ran your gloved hand along the underside of an eave after the warm winter day. They disappeared before they hit the linoleum. He glanced around. Nothing in the room glowed, shimmered, or vibrated. Auras were gone again. He began to let out a sigh of relief, and then, from outside on Harris Avenue, a car backfired. In the empty second-floor apartment, Ralph Roberts screamed. Section 4. He didn't want any more tea, but he was still thirsty. He found half a Diet Pepsi, flat but wet, in the back of the fridge, poured it into a plastic cup with a faded red apple logo on it, and took it outside. He could no longer stand to be in the apartment, which seemed to smell of unhappy wakefulness, especially not after what had happened with the phone. The day had become even more beautiful, if that was possible. The strong, mild wind had developed, rolling bands of light and shadow across the west side of Derry and combing the leaves from the trees. These the wind sent hurrying along the sidewalks and rattling in dervishes of orange and yellow and red. Ralph turned left not because he had any conscious desire to revisit the picnic area by the airport, but only because he wanted the wind at his back. Nevertheless, he found himself entering the little clearing again some 10 minutes later. This time it was empty, and he wasn't surprised. There was no edge on the wind that had sprung up, nothing to make old men and women scurry indoors, but it was hard work keeping cards on the table or chess pieces on the board when the puckish wind kept trying to snatch them away. As Ralph approached the small trestle table where Fay Chapin usually held court, he was not exactly surprised to see a note held down by a rock, and he had a good idea what the subject would be even before he put down his plastic red cup and picked it up. 2 walks, 2 sightings of bald Doc with a scalpel, 2 old people suffering insomnia and seeing brightly colored visions. 2 notes. It's like Noah leading the animals onto the ark, not one by one, but in pairs. And is another hard rain going to fall? Well, what do you think, old man? He didn't know what he thought. But Bill's note had been a kind of obituary in progress, and he had absolutely no doubt that Fay was the same thing. That sense of being carried forward effortlessly and without hesitation was simply too strong to doubt. It was like awakening on some alien stage to find oneself speaking lines, or stumbling through them anyway, in a drama for which one could not remember having rehearsed, or seeing a coherent shape in had up until then looked like complete nonsense, or discovering. Discovering what? Another secret city, that's what, he murmured. An area of auras. Then he bent over Fay's note and read it while the wind played prankishly with his thinning hair. Section 5. I know, Adrian, we could damn well be Bigfoot, aka Squatch. Those of you who want to pay your final respects to Jimmy Vandermeer are advised to do so by tomorrow at the very latest. Father Coughlin came by this noon and told me the poor old guy is sinking fast. He can have visitors, though. He is in Derry Home, ICU, room 315. Remember that time is short. Faye. Ralph read the note twice, put it back on the table with a rock on top to weigh it down for the next old croc to happen along. then simply stood there with his hands in his pockets and his head down, gazing out at runway 3 from beneath the bushy tangle of his brows. A crisp leaf, orange as one of the Halloween pumpkins which would soon decorate the street, came flipping down from the deep blue sky and landed in his sparse hair. Ralph brushed away absently and thought of 2 hospital rooms on home's ICU floor. 2 rooms side by side, Bob Holhorst in one and Jimmy V in the other. And the next room up the hall, well, that one was 317, the room in which his wife had died. This is not a coincidence, he said softly. But what was it? Shapes in the mist? A secret city? Evocative phrases, both of them, but they answered no questions. Ralph sat on top of the picnic table next to the one upon which Fay had left his note, took off his shoes, and crossed his legs. The wind gusted, ruffling his hair. He sat there amid the falling leaves, with his head slightly bent and his brow furrowed in thought. He looked like a Winslow Homer version of Buddha as he meditated with his hands cupping his kneecaps, carefully reviewing his impressions of Doc Number 1 and Doc Number 2, and then contrasting these impressions with those he'd gotten of Doc Number 3. First impression? All 3 docs had reminded him of the aliens in tabloids like Inside View, and pictures which were always labeled artist conceptions. Ralph knew that these bald-headed, dark-eyed images of mysterious visitors from space went back a good many years. People had been reporting contacts with short baldies, the so-called little doctors, for a long time, maybe for as long as people had been reporting UFOs. He was quite sure that he had read at least one such account way back in the 60s. Okay, so say there are quite a few of these fellows around, Ralph told the sparrow, which had just lit on the picnic area's little barrel. Not just 3 docs, but 300 or 3,000. Lois and I aren't the only ones who've seen them in. And didn't most people who gave accounts of such meetings also mention sharp objects? Yes, but not scissors or scalpels, at least Ralph didn't think so. Most of the people who claimed to have been abducted by little bald doctors talked about probes, didn't they? The sparrow flew off. Ralph didn't notice. He was thinking about the little bald doctors who had visited May Loker on the night of her death. What else did he know of them? What else had he seen? They'd been dressed in white smocks, like the ones worn on TV shows that doctors in the 50s and 60s, like the ones pharmacists still wore, only their smocks, unlike the one worn by Doc Number 3, had been clean. Number 3 had been toting a rusty scalpel. If there had been any rust on the scissors Doc Number 1 had been holding in his right hand, Ralph hadn't noticed. Not even after he'd trained the binoculars on them. Something else, probably not important, but at least you noticed it. Scissors-toting Doc was right-handed, at least, judging from the way he held his weapon. Scalpel-wielding Doc is a southpaw. No, probably not important, but something about it. Another of those shapes in the mist. This a small one. Tug at him just the same. Something about the dichotomy of left and right. Go to the left and you'll be right, Ralph muttered, repeating the punchline of some joke he no longer even remembered. Go to the right and you'll be left. Never mind, what else did he know about the docks? Well, they had been surrounded by auras, of course, rather lovely greenish gold ones. And they had left those white man tracks. Arthur Murray danced diagrams behind them, and although their features had struck him as perfectly anonymous, their auras had conveyed feelings of power and sobriety and dignity, goddammit, Ralph said. The wind gusted again, and more leaves blew down from the trees. Some 50 yards from the picnic area, not far from the old train tracks, a twisted, half-uprooted tree seemed to reach in Ralph's direction, stretching branches that actually did look a little like clutching hands. It suddenly occurred to Ralph that he had been quite a lot that night for an old guy who was supposed to be living on the edge of the last age of man, the one Shakespeare and Bill McGovern called the slippered pantaloon, and none of it, not one single thing, suggested danger or evil intent. That Ralph had inferred evil intent wasn't very surprising. They were physically freakish strangers. He had observed them coming out of a sick woman's house at a time of night when visitors seldom, if ever, called. He had seen them only minutes after waking from a nightmare of epic proportions. Now, however, recollecting what he had seen, other things recurred. The way that birds stood on Mrs. Booker's stoop, for instance, as if they had every right to be there. The sense he had gotten of two old friends indulging themselves in a bit of conversation before going on their way. Two old buddies talking it over one more time before heading home after a long night's work. That was your impression, yes, but that doesn't mean you could trust it, Ralph. Ralph thought he could trust it. Old friends, longtime colleagues, done for the night. Mealworkers had been their last stop. Alright, so docks number 1 and number 2 were as different from the third one as days from night. They were clean while he was dirty. They were invested with auras while he had none. None that Ralph had seen, at least. They carried scissors while he carried a scalpel. They seemed as sane and sober as a couple of respected village elders, while number 3 seemed as crazy as a shithouse rat. One thing is perfectly clear, though, isn't it? Your playmates are supernatural beings, and other than Lois, the only person who seems to know they're there is Ed DeMule. Want to bet on how much sleep Ed is getting just lately? No, Ralph said. He raised his hands from his knees and held them in front of his eyes. They were shaking a little. Ed had mentioned bald doctors, and there were bald docs. One of the docs he'd been talking about when he talked about centurions? Ralph didn't know. He almost hoped so, because the word centurions had begun to call up a much more terrible image in his mind each time it occurred to him. The ring race from Tolkien's fantasy trilogy hooded figures astride skeletal red-eyed horses bearing down on a small party of cowering hobbits outside the Prancing Pony Tavern in Bree. Thinking of hobbits made him think of Lois, and the trim wing in his hands grew worse. Carolyn, it's a long walk back to Eden, sweetheart, so don't sweat the small stuff. Lois, in my family, dying at 80 is dying young. Joe Weiser, the medical examiner usually ends up writing suicide on the cause of death line rather than insomnia. Bill, his specialty was the Civil War, and now he doesn't even know what a Civil War is, let alone who won ours. Denise Polhurst, death is very stupid. An obstetrician this low in cutting a baby's umbilical cord. It was as if someone had suddenly clicked on a bright searchlight inside his head, and Ralph cried out into the sunny autumn afternoon. Not even the Delta 727 settling in for a landing on runway 3 could entirely drown that cry. Section 6. He spent the rest of the afternoon sitting on the porch of the house he shared with McGovern, waiting impatiently for Lois to come back from her card game. Could have tried McGovern again at the hospital, but didn't. The need to speak to McGovern had passed. Ralph didn't understand everything yet, but he thought he understood a great deal more than he had. And if his sudden flash of insight at the picnic area had any validity at all, telling McGovern what had happened to his Panama would serve absolutely no purpose, even if Bill believed him. I have to get that hat back, Ralph thought, and I have to get Lois's earrings back too. It was an amazing late afternoon and early evening. On the one hand, nothing happened. On the other hand, everything happened. The world of auras came and went around him like the stately progression of cloud shadows across the west side. Ralph sat and watched, rapt, breaking off only to eat a little and make a trip to the bathroom. He saw old Mrs. Bennigan standing on her front porch in her bright red coat, clutching her walker and taking inventory of her fall flowers. He saw the aura surrounding her, the scrubbed and healthy pink of a freshly bathed infant, and hoped Mrs. B didn't have a lot of relatives waiting around for her to die. He saw a young man of no more than 20 bopping along the other side of the street toward the Red Apple. He was the picture of health in his faded jeans and sleeveless Celtic jersey. But Ralph could see a death bag clinging to him like an oil slick, and the balloon string rising from the crown of his head that looked like a decaying drape pole in a haunted house. He saw no little bald doctors, but shortly after 5:30, he observed a startling shaft of purple light erupt from a manhole cover in the middle of Harris Avenue. It rose into the sky like a special effect in a Cecil B. DeMille Bible epic for perhaps 3 minutes, and simply winked out. He also saw a huge bird that looked like a prehistoric hawk go floating between the chimneys of the old dairy building around the corner on Howard Street, and alternating red and blue thermals twisting over Strawford Park in long lazy ribbons. When soccer practice at Fairmont Grammar let out at 5:45, a dozen or so kids came swarming into the parking lot of the Red Apple, where they would buy tons of pre-supper candy and bales of trading cards, football cards by this time of year, Ralph supposed. 2 of them stopped to argue about something, and their auras, one green and the other a vibrant shade of burnt orange, intensified, drew in, and began to gleam with rising spirals of scarlet thread. "Get out!" Ralph shouted mentally at the boy within the orange envelope of light. Just a moment before, Green Boy dropped his school books and socked the other in the mouth. The 2 of them grappled, spun around in a clumsy, aggressive dance, then tumbled to the sidewalk. A little circle of yelling, cheering kids formed around them. A purplish-red dome like a thunderhead began to build up around and above the fight. Ralph found this shape, with his circulating in a slow counterclockwise movement, both terrible and beautiful, and he wondered what the aura above a full-scale military battle would look like. He decided that was a question to which he didn't really want an answer, just as Orange Boy climbed on top of Green Boy and began to pummel him in earnest. Sue came out of the store and hollered at them to quit fighting in the damn parking lot. Orange Boy dismounted reluctantly. The combatants rose to their feet, looking at each other warily. Then Green Boy, trying to appear nonchalant, turned and went into the store. Only his quick glance back over his shoulder to make sure his opponent was not pursuing spoiled the effect. The spectators were either following Green Boy into the store for their post-practice supplies or clustered around Orange Boy, congratulating him. Above them, unseen, that virulent red-purple toadstool was breaking up like a cloud back before a strong wind. Pieces of it tattered, unraveled, and disappeared. The street is a carnival of energy, Ralph thought. The juice thrown off by those 2 boys during the 90 seconds they were mixing it up looked like enough to light dairy for a week, and if a person could tap the energy the watchers generated, the energy inside that mushroom cloud, you could probably light the whole state of Maine for a month. Can you imagine what it would be like to enter the world of auras in Times Square at 2 minutes to midnight on New Year's Eve? He couldn't and didn't want to. He suspected he had glimpsed the leading edge of a force so huge and so vital that it made all the nuclear weapons created since 1945 seem about as powerful as a child's cat pistol fired into an empty peach can. Enough force to destroy the universe, perhaps, or to create a new one. Ralph went upstairs, dumped a can of beans into one pot and a couple hot dogs into another, and walked impatiently back to the 4th through the flat, snapping his fingers and occasionally running his fingers through his hair as he waited for this impromptu bachelor's supper to cook. The bone deep weariness which had hung on him like invisible weights ever since midsummer was, for the time being at least, entirely gone. He felt filled with manic, antic energy, absolutely stuffed with it. He supposed this was why people liked benzodrine and cocaine, only he had an idea that this was a much better high, that when it departed, it would not leave him feeling plundered and mistreated, more used than ever. Ralph Roberts, unaware that the hair his fingers were combing through had grown thicker, and that threads of black were visible in it for the first time in 5 years, dived toward his apartment, walking on the balls of his feet, first humming, then singing an old rock and roll tune from the early 60s. Hey, pretty baby, you can't sit down. You gotta slop, bop, slip, slop, flip, top, all about. The beans were bubbling in their pot, the hot dogs boiling in theirs. Only it looked to Ralph almost as if they were dancing in there, doing the Bristol stomp to the old DeVille's tune. He was singing at the top of his lungs. When you hear the hippie with the backbeat, you can't sit down. Ralph cut the hot dogs into the beans, dumped in half a pint of ketchup, added some chili sauce, then stirred everything vigorously together and headed for the door. He carried his supper still in the pot in one hand. He ran down the stairs as nimbly as a kid who's running late on the first day of school. He hooked a baggy old cardigan sweater, McGovern's, but what the hell? Out of the front hall closet and then went back out to the porch. Oars were gone, but Ralph wasn't dismayed. For the time being, he was more interested in the smell of food. He couldn't remember the last time he'd felt so flat-out hungry as he did that moment. He sat on the top step, with his long thighs and bony knees sticking out on either side of him, looking decidedly Ichabod Crane-ish, and began to eat. The first few bites burned his lips and tongue, but instead of being deterred, Ralph ate faster, almost gobbling. He paused with half the pot of beans and Frank's consumed. The animal in his stomach hadn't gone back to sleep, not yet, but it had been pacified a bit. Ralph belched unselfconsciously and looked out at Harris Avenue with a feeling of contentment he hadn't known in years. Under the current circumstances, that feeling made no sense at all, but that didn't change it in the slightest. When was the last time he'd felt this good? Maybe not since the morning he'd awakened in that barn somewhere between Derry, Maine, and Poughkeepsie, New York, amazed by the conflicting rays of light, thousands of them, it had seemed, which crisscrossed the warm, sweet-smelling place where he lay. Or maybe never. Yes, or maybe never. He spied Mrs. Perrine coming up the street, probably returning for a safe place, the combination soup kitchen and homeless shelter down by the canal. Ralph once again found himself fascinated by her strange gliding walk, which she achieved without the aid of a cane and seemingly without any side-by-side movement of her hips. Her hair, still more black than gray, was now held, or perhaps subdued was the word, by the hairnet she wore on the serving line. Thick support hose, the color of cotton candy, rose from her spotless white nurse's shoes. Not that Ralph could see much of either of them or the legs they covered. This evening, Mrs. Perrine wore a man's wool overcoat, and the hem came almost to her ankles. She seemed to depend almost entirely on her upper legs to move her along. Sign of some chronic back problem, Ralph guessed, and this mode of locomotion, coupled with the overcoat, gave Esther Perrine a somewhat surreal aspect as she approached. She looked like the Black Queen on a chessboard, a piece that was either being guided by an invisible hand or moving all by itself. As she neared the place where Ralph sat, still wearing the ripped shirt and now eating his supper directly from the pot in the bargain, the oars began to steal back into the world again. The street lights had already come on, and now Ralph saw delicate lavender arcs hung over each. He could also see a red haze hovering above some roofs, a yellow haze above others, a pale cerise above still others. In the east, where night was now gathering itself, the horizon flocked with dim green speckles. Closer to hand, he watched as Mrs. Perrine's aura sprang to life around her, that firm gray that reminded him of a West Point cadet's uniform. A few darker spots like phantom buttons shimmered above her bosom. Ralph assumed there was a bosom hidden beneath there somewhere. He was not sure, but thought these might be signs of impending ill health. Evening, Mrs. Perrine, he said politely, and watched as the words rose in front of his eyes in snowflake shapes. She gave him a penetrating glance, looking her eyes up and down, seeming to simultaneously sum him up and dismiss him in a single look. "I see you're still wearing that same shirt, Roberts," she said. What she didn't say, but what Ralph was sure she was thinking, was, "I also see you sitting there and eating beans right out of the pot, like some ragged street person who never learned any better. And I have a way of remembering what I see, Roberts." "So I am," Ralph said. I guess I forgot to change it. Said Mrs. Perrine. And Nellie thought it was his underwear she was considering. When was the last time it occurred to you to change that? I shudder to think, Roberts. Lovely evening, isn't it, Mrs. Perrine? Another of those bird-like glances, this time up at the sky, then back to Ralph. It's going to turn cold. Do you think so? Oh yes, Indian summer's over. My back isn't good for much besides weather forecasting these days, but at that it does very well. He paused. I believe that's Bill McGovern's sweater. I guess it is, Ralph agreed, wondering if she would ask him next if Bill knew he had it. He wouldn't have put it past her. Instead, she told him to button it up. You don't want to be the candidate for pneumonia, do you? She asked, and then tucked sit of her mouth added, as well as for the nut house. Absolutely not, Ralph said. He set the pot aside, reached for the sweater buttons, then stopped. He was still wearing a quilted stove glove on his left hand. He hadn't noticed it until now. It will be easier if you take that off, Mrs. Perrine said. There might have been the faintest gleam in her eyes. I suppose so, Ralph said humbly. He took off the glove and buttoned McGovern's sweater. Whatever holds good, Roberts. Beg your pardon. I offered to mend your shirt. If you can bring yourself to part with it for a day or so, that is. She paused. You do have another shirt, I assume. One you could wear while I'm in the one you have on? Oh, yes, Ralph said. You bet. Quite a few of them. Choosing among them each day must be challenging for you. There's bean juice on your chin, Roberts. With this pronouncement, Mrs. Perrine's eyes flicked forward and she began to march once more. What Ralph did then, he did with no forethought or understanding. It was as instinctive as the chopping gesture he had made earlier to scare Doc Number 3 away from Rosalie. He raised the hand which had been wearing the thermal glove and curled it into a tube around his mouth. Then he inhaled sharply, producing a faint, whispery whistle. The results were amazing. The pencil of gray light poked out of Mrs. Perrine's aura like a quill of a porcupine. It lengthened rapidly, angling backwards as the lady herself moved forward, until it crossed the leaf-littered lawn and darted into the tube, formed by Ralph's curled fingers. He felt it enter him as he inhaled, and it was like swelling pure energy. He suddenly felt lit up, like a neon sign or a marquee of a big city movie theater. An explosive sense of force, a feeling of pow, ran through his chest and stomach, and raced down his legs all the way to the tips of his toes. At the same time, it rocketed upward into his head, threatening to blow off the top of his skull, as if it were the thin concrete roof of a missile silo. He could see rays of light as gray as electrified fog smoking out from between his fingers. A terrible, joyous sense of power lit up his thoughts, but only for a moment. It was followed by shame and amazed horror. Oh man, I just realized that, my speaker peeps, I have to say goodbye. I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your weekend. Take care of my ears, don't work too hard, and like I said in here, don't take life too seriously. See you again, back here, same crazy time, same crazy place. Alright, well, that was our speaker crew. We'll go ahead and try to finish this chapter, so that way we're not starting in the middle of a chapter next time. An explosive sense of force, a feeling of pow, ran through his chest and stomach, then raced down his legs all the way to the tips of his toes. At the same time, it rocketed upward into his head, threatening to blow off the top of his skull. He could see rays of light, as gray as electrified fog. What are you doing, Ralph? Whatever that stuff is, it doesn't belong to you. Would you reach into her purse and take some of her money while she wasn't looking? He felt his face flush. He lowered his cupped hand and shut his mouth. As his lips and teeth came together, he clearly heard and actually felt something crunch crisply inside. It was the sound you heard when you were chomping off a bite of fresh rhubarb. Mrs. Perrine stopped and Ralph watched apprehensively as she made a half turn and looked out at Harris Avenue. I didn't mean to, he thought, ever. Honest, I didn't, Mrs. P. I'm still learning my way around this thing. Robert? Yes? Did you hear something? It sounded almost like a gunshot. Ralph could feel his ears throbbing with hot blood as he shook his head. No, but my ears aren't what they... Probably just a backfire over on Kansas Street, she said, dismissing his weak sister excuses out of hand. It made my heart miss a beat, though, I can tell you. She carried off again in her odd, gliding chest-clean walk, then stopped once more and looked back at him. Her aura had begun to fade out of Ralph's view, but he had no trouble seeing her eyes. They were as sharp as kestrels. You look different, Roberts, she said. Younger, somehow. Ralph, who had expected something else, gave back what you stole, Roberts, and this minute, for instance, would only flounder. Do you think that's very, does they think you? He flapped an impatient, oh, shut up hand at him. Probably the light. I advise you not to dribble on that sweater, Roberts. My impression of Mr. McGovern is that he is a man who takes care of his things. He should have taken better care of his hat, Ralph said. Those bright eyes, which had begun once more to shift away from him, shifted back. I beg your pardon? It's Panama, Ralph said. He lost it somewhere. Mrs. Perrine held this up to the light of her intellect for a moment, then cast it aside with another. Get inside, Roberts. If you stay out here much longer, you'll catch your death of cold. And then she slid upon her way, not visibly the worse for wear as a result of Ralph's thoughtless act of thievery. Thievery? I'm pretty sure that's the wrong word, Ralph. What you did just now was a lot closer to vampirism, Ralph said bleakly. He put the pot of beans aside and began to slowly rub his hands together. He felt ashamed, guilty, and all but exploding with energy. You stole some of her life force instead of her blood, but a vampire is a vampire, Ralph. Yes, indeed, and it suddenly occurred to Ralph that this must not have been the first time he had done such a thing. You look different, Roberts, younger somehow. That was what Mrs. Perrine had said tonight, but people had been making similar comments to him ever since the end of summer, hadn't they? The main reason his friends hadn't hectored him into going to the doctor was because he didn't look like anything was wrong with him. He complained of insomnia, but he apparently looked like the picture of health. I guess that honeycomb must have really turned the trick, Johnny Lydecker had said just before the two of them had left the library on Sunday. Back in the Iron Age, that felt like now. And when Ralph had asked him what he was talking about, Lydecker had said he was talking about Ralph's insomnia. You look a gajillion times better than on the day I first met you. Lydecker hadn't been the only one. Ralph had been more or less dragging himself through the days, feeling folded, spindled, and mutilated. But people kept telling him how good he looked, how refreshed he looked, how young he looked. Helen, McGovern, even Faye Chapin had said something a week or two ago, although Ralph couldn't remember exactly what. Sure I do, he said in a low, dismayed voice. He asked me if I was using wrinkle cream. Wrinkle cream, for God's sake! Had he been stealing from the life force of others even back then? Stealing without even knowing it? I must have been, he said in the same low voice. Dear Jesus, I'm a vampire. But was that the right word? He wondered suddenly. Wasn't it at least possible that, in the world of auras, a life stealer was called a centurion? Ted's pallid, frantic face rose before him like a ghost which returns to accuse its murderer, and Ralph, suddenly terrified, wrapped his arms around his knees and lowered his head to rest upon them. All right, we got through that chapter. We did it! Well, thank you so much once again for hanging out with me on We Are Paradox Media's Late Night in the Rockies. It was a pleasure reading to you this evening. Thank you to all of our friends on We Are Paradox Media's Facebook, KPNL Twitter, Spreaker, iHeartRadio, and wherever else you may be listening beyond the Omniverse tonight. I had a wonderful time. I can't wait to do it again next weekend. I don't know what we're doing. Might be more trippy TikToks. Of course, story time on Sunday. Don't forget, guys, we're all in this together. Together, we can make the world a bit better. And together, my friends, we are Paradox Media because without you, there is no us. Until next time, nighty-night. love and light. Have a wonderful rest of your weekend. And like I said, don't work too hard this week. Don't take life too seriously and enjoy every minute, every hour, every day you can, because tomorrow is not promised. So see you back here. Same crazy time, same crazy place.